Mistreated black daughter shocks millionaire father. At his own gala, the crowd calls her boss. She walked into the ballroom wearing a simple black gown, no diamonds, no designer labels, just quiet authority, stitched into clean lines. Around her, chandeliers rained gold onto bodies wrapped in couture, each guest glittering like a star designed to mock the night. Whispers began the moment she entered. Is she staff? Did she come from the service door? She looks out of place. Richard Hawthorne's guests assessed her like a misplaced object. His wife glanced once and dismissed her completely. A socialite whispered loudly, "Events like this need proper help. Someone should tell her where to stand." Favour stood still, absorbing it all the way. One might endure a cold wind, bracing but unaffected. None of them knew she was the strategist, the invisible architect behind boardroom revolutions and saved empires. She was the ghost of power who shaped industries with anonymous brilliance. Richard approached her only to mutter, "Please don't draw attention. Tonight is important." The sentence landed like a slap she'd heard her entire childhood. But when a tech CEO across the room froze mid-sentence, recognition dawning in his eyes, everything changed. He crossed the ballroom in stunned silence, his polished shoes echoing on marble. Then he dropped to his knees before her right there, in front of everyone, and whispered with trembling reverence, "You saved my company, my family, my life, boss." The room shattered into silence. The woman they mocked for her simplicity was the invisible force who held their futures in her hands. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us, have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked? Drop your story in the comments, because true power doesn't need to announce itself. The first time Favour felt invisible, she was 7 years old. She had been standing in the foyer of the Hawthorne mansion, clutching a crayon drawing she'd made in school, a house with a big sun and 4 stick figures holding hands. Her teacher had written, "Beautiful family," across the top in looping red letters. Favour had drawn herself in the middle. She waited by the grand staircase for over an hour, the paper crinkling in her sweaty palms, watching as Richard Hawthorne came through the door in his charcoal suit, his briefcase swinging, his face already turned toward the living room, where his son Oliver was building a Lego tower on the Persian rug. "Dad! Dad, look what I made!" Oliver shouted, and Richard's face broke into a wide, warm smile. "That's incredible, champ. You're going to be an architect one day." Favour stepped forward. "Daddy, But Richard had already walked past her. He didn't even glance down. Her mother found her an hour later, still standing there, the drawing crumpled in her fist. She knelt and pulled Favour into her arms, and Favour felt the tremble in her mother's chest, not from sadness, but from rage she refused to release. "Baby," her mother whispered, smoothing her hair, "don't ever wait for someone to see you. You hear me? Don't wait." Favour didn't understand it then, but she would. By the time she turned 12, invisibility had become her language. She learned to move through the Hawthorne estate like a shadow present, but unacknowledged. She sat at the far end of the dinner table during the rare occasions Richard allowed her to join. She listened to her half-siblings, Oliver and Grace, talk about their private school, their skiing trips, their college funds, while she attended the public school 3 miles away and took the bus home alone. Richard's wife, Carolyn, spoke to her only in clipped instructions. "Don't leave your shoes in the hallway. You're too loud in the mornings. We're hosting guests tonight. Stay in your room." Favour obeyed, because disobedience would mean her mother losing the small apartment Richard paid for as part of his arrangement, a word Favour came to hate. She and her mother weren't family. They were a transaction, a mistake he managed from a distance. But her mother never let her believe she was the mistake. "You're brilliant, Favour," she would say, every single night before bed. "You're going to do things that make the world stop and listen. And when that day comes, baby, don't you dare shrink yourself for anyone." Favour believed her. She had to. At 15, Favour discovered economics. Not in a classroom, but in the books she stole from Richard's private library, the one room in the house she wasn't supposed to enter. She would wait until the house went silent, then slip inside and pull texts off the shelves. The Wealth of Nations, Freakonomics, Thinking Fast and Slow. She read by flashlight under her blankets, absorbing theories on market behavior, game theory, systems thinking. She began to see the world not as chaos, but as patterns. Problems weren't obstacles, they were puzzles. And Favour was very, very good at puzzles. Her first case was her mother's job. Her mother worked as an administrative assistant at a struggling non-profit that provided after-school programs for underserved communities. Funding was drying up. Layoffs were coming. Her mother came home every night with red eyes and a tighter jaw. Favour spent 2 weeks analysing their donor reports, operational expenses, and outreach strategies. Then she drafted a memo, anonymous, professional, surgical, and slipped it into the director's mailbox. 3 months later, the non-profit secured a 6-figure grant. Her mother kept her job. No one ever knew it was a 15-year-old girl who saved them. But Favour knew. And it lit something inside her that wouldn't go out. At 18, the night everything shattered, Favour had been sitting in the hallway outside Richard's office. Inside, she could hear him on the phone with his lawyer. "Yes, I know she's legally entitled to acknowledged paternity, but I don't want her name attached to mine publicly. It complicates things. The optics are difficult." A pause. "She's fine. Her mother's fine. I've provided financially. That's enough." Favour's hands went numb. She had spent 18 years hoping foolishly, desperately, that one day he would claim her, introduce her, love her. But to Richard Hawthorne, she wasn't a daughter. She was a complication. That night, she packed a single duffel bag. She didn't say goodbye to Oliver or Grace. She left a note for her mother on the kitchen counter. "I'm not running away. I'm running toward. I love you. I'll call soon." She walked out of the Hawthorne estate and never looked back. Her mother found her 3 days later in a youth shelter. She didn't drag her home. She sat beside her on the narrow cot and held her hand. "What do you need?" she asked. "A chance," Favour whispered. "Just one chance to build something he can't take credit for." Her mother smiled through tears. "Then, let's get you that chance." Richard Hawthorne did not think of himself as a cruel man. He thought of himself as practical, strategic, a man who understood that life was a series of calculated choices and sentiment was a liability. He had built Hawthorne Capital from the ground up well, from his father's modest real estate portfolio up into a multi-billion-dollar investment empire. He sat on boards, he lunched with senators. His name opened doors that money alone couldn't. And yes, he had made mistakes. Favour's mother, Diane, had been one of them. She had worked in his office 26 years ago, a sharp, beautiful woman with a laugh that made the room feel warmer. He'd been married for 3 years. Carolyn had just given birth to Oliver. He was tired, stretched thin, and Diane had been there. It lasted 4 months. When she told him she was pregnant, his first thought wasn't joy or fear. It was, how do I contain this? He paid for everything. Medical bills, an apartment, private schooling if she wanted it, though. Diane refused, opting for public school out of pride. He set up a trust fund, signed documents, kept his word, but he never let Favour into his life. Carolyn knew, of course. She'd known from the beginning. But they had an understanding. As long as Favour remained a ghost, unseen, unspoken, unintroduced, Carolyn would tolerate her existence. "I will not have her at our table," Carolyn had said, her voice ice over stone. "I will not have our children confused. You made your mess. You manage it quietly." So he did. Richard saw Favour maybe 10 times a year. Brief, awkward encounters in hallways or during obligatory holiday visits Diane insisted on. He wrote checks. He kept his distance. He told himself, It was for the best. But lately, the distance had become a problem. 3 months ago, a journalist had published an exposé alleging that Richard Hawthorne had an illegitimate black daughter he refused to publicly acknowledge. The article didn't name Favour, but it didn't have to. The implications were enough. Millionaire's secret shame, the daughter he hides. His investors grew nervous. Board members asked quiet, pointed questions. His carefully curated image, philanthropist, family man, self-made leader, began to crack. His PR team gave him one solution: reconcile. Publicly. Invite her to the gala, his publicist urged. Show the world you're taking steps, that you're a father working to heal old wounds. The optics will be powerful. Richard hated it. But he hated bad press more. So he sent the invitation. He didn't call. He didn't write a letter. He had his assistant send a formal card with embossed gold lettering. You are cordially invited to the Hawthorne annual charity gala. No personal note, no apology, just an invitation. And to his surprise, she accepted. Now, standing in the center of his own ballroom, surrounded by 500 of the most powerful people in the city, Richard Hawthorne felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: unease. He spotted her the moment she entered. That simple black dress, her hair pulled back, her expression unreadable. She looked so much like Diane, it made his chest tighten. But she also looked unbothered, calm, almost amused. That unsettled him. Richard, darling. Who is that? Carolyn's voice was sharp beside him. No one important, he lied. Just a guest. Carolyn's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago not to ask questions she didn't want answered. Richard crossed the room, his smile fixed in place, his hand extended in a performance of warmth. Favour, he said quietly. I'm glad you came. She looked at his hand, but didn't take it. Are you? She asked. The question hung in the air, delicate and dangerous. Of course, he said, his voice dropping. Look, I know things have been complicated, but tonight is important for both of us, so please. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Just don't draw attention. Let's get through this evening, and then we can talk. Really talk. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, something he couldn't name. Of course, Richard, she said softly. I wouldn't dream of making a scene. He nodded, relieved, and walked away. He didn't see the faint smile on her lips. He didn't know that across the room, a man in a tailored grey suit had just frozen mid-sentence, his champagne glass tilting in his hand, his eyes locked on the woman in the simple black dress. He didn't know that in 60 seconds, his entire world was about to collapse. The man in the tailored grey suit stood frozen across the ballroom, his champagne flute trembling in his hand. His name was Jonathan Pierce. He was the CEO of a tech empire valued at $3 billion. He had flown in from Singapore for this gala. He was supposed to be networking, shaking hands, securing deals. But the moment he heard her voice, calm, measured, polite as she declined a server's offer of champagne, his entire body locked in place. He knew that voice. He had heard it only once before, 2 years ago, through an encrypted phone call that saved his company from total collapse. He'd been on the verge of bankruptcy. His board was preparing to oust him. His investors had fled. He was 48 hours from losing everything. And then she called. No name, no face, just a voice and a strategy so precise, so devastatingly effective, that within 6 months his company had not only survived, it had exploded. IPO, global expansion, billion-dollar valuations. The world credited him, but Jonathan knew the truth. It was her, the strategist. He had tried for years to find her, hired investigators, offered ridiculous sums of money just for a meeting, but she was a ghost, untraceable, anonymous. And now she was standing 20 feet away from him in a simple black dress, being dismissed like she didn't matter. His heart hammered against his ribs. He set down his glass with shaking hands and began walking toward her, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. Conversations blurred around him. The orchestra faded. All he could see was her. Favour saw him coming. She had known he would be here. She had seen his name on the guest list weeks ago when she decided to accept Richard's invitation. She could have avoided him, could have turned away, but she didn't. She stood perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her, and waited. Jonathan stopped 3 feet away. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes were wet. "It's you," he whispered. The words cracked in the middle, raw and disbelieving. Favour tilted her head slightly. "I'm sorry. Have we met?" Her voice was cool, detached, a wall between them. But Jonathan shook his head, tears now streaming openly down his face. He didn't care who was watching. He didn't care about the phones already lifting, the whispers starting to ripple outward like shock waves. 2 years ago, he said, his voice breaking, I was going to lose everything. My company, my family's future. I was ready to end it all. He took a shuddering breath. And then you called. You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. But you saved me. The ballroom had gone deathly quiet now. Favour's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes, something soft and ancient and tired. Jonathan dropped to his knees. Gasps erupted around them, phones shot up, flashes sparked. The golden light of the chandeliers seemed to bend toward them, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I don't know why you're here, Jonathan said, his voice shaking, or why anyone in this room would dare treat you like you're invisible. But you need to know. His voice broke completely. You are the reason my daughter still has a father. You are the reason 50,000 people still have jobs. You're the reason I'm still alive. He looked up at her, his face wet and open and devastated with gratitude. Thank you, boss. The word echoed. Boss. Favour stood perfectly still, her hands trembling now, just barely, just enough that only someone looking closely would see. She looked down at Jonathan, and for the first time all night, the mask slipped. Her eyes softened, her lips parted, and when she spoke, her voice was barely louder than a breath. You did the hard part, Jonathan. I just showed you the door. You're the one who walked through it. Jonathan shook his head, smiling through his tears. No. You gave me hope when I had none left. He stayed on his knees. And then, slowly, like a wave building across the ocean, other people in the room began to recognize her. A woman in a silver gown gasped, Wait, is she? A man in a tuxedo pulled out his phone, scrolling frantically. Oh my God, that's her. That's the strategist. Another voice, louder now. She's the one who restructured the Gaines Foundation. She saved the Indonesian housing project. She advised the Canadian energy transition. The murmurs grew into a roar. Richard stood across the room, his face pale, his hand gripping a glass so tightly it looked ready to shatter. Carolyn beside him had gone completely still, her mouth slightly open in shock. Favour looked around the ballroom at the faces that had mocked her, dismissed her, assumed she was nothing, and now stared at her like she had just descended from the sky. She felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest. The years of silence, the years of being unseen. And yet, standing here now, she realized something. She didn't need their recognition. She never had, but it was satisfying to watch them finally see her. Jonathan finally stood, brushing the tears from his face. He looked at her with something close to reverence. If there's ever anything you need, he said quietly, anything at all, just say the word. Favour smiled, small and sad. There's nothing I need from anyone here, Jonathan. But thank you. She turned then, her gaze sweeping across the room one last time before landing on Richard. He stood frozen, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand, his face a portrait of confusion and creeping dread. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Richard Hawthorne understood. The daughter he had spent 25 years hiding had become someone far more powerful than he ever was, and everyone in this room now knew it. Richard's hand was still trembling when he set his champagne glass down on the nearest table. The delicate clink of crystal against marble was swallowed by the low roar of whispers flooding the ballroom. He couldn't breathe properly. Around him, his guests, the senators, the investors, the celebrities he'd spent months courting were no longer looking at him. They were looking at her. Their phones were out. Fingers were scrolling. Faces were lighting up with recognition, shock, disbelief. That's her. The strategist is Richard's daughter? How did we not know? Carolyn appeared at his side, her face a mask of controlled fury. She leaned in close, her voice a sharp hiss beneath the noise. Richard, what the hell is going on? He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What could he possibly say? I had no idea. I never asked. I never cared enough to find out. Carolyn's eyes narrowed. Fix this. Now. She turned on her heel and disappeared into the crowd, her silver gown glinting like a blade. Richard looked back toward Favour. She was standing exactly where she had been, calm and still, while Jonathan Pierce and two other executives now flanked her like guards. One of them, a woman Richard recognized as the founder of a billion-dollar logistics company, was speaking to Favour in low, reverent tones. Favour nodded, responded briefly, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at Richard, and somehow that was worse than if she had. He forced himself to move, cutting through the crowd with a fixed smile that felt like it was cracking his face in half. Guests stepped aside as he approached, their eyes tracking him with a new kind of scrutiny. Sharp, judgmental, hungry for drama. Favour, he said, his voice loud enough to sound confident, but not loud enough to draw more attention. Can we talk, privately? She turned to him slowly, and for a moment he saw his own reflection in her eyes, small, desperate, diminished. I don't think now is the time, Richard, she said evenly. Please. The word came out harder than he meant it to. Just 5 minutes. Jonathan stepped forward, protective. I don't think the lady wants to be disturbed. She's my daughter, Richard snapped, the words escaping before he could stop them. The room seemed to inhale sharply. Favour's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, something cold and cutting. Am I? She asked softly. The question hung in the air like a knife. Richard's throat tightened. He could feel eyes on him from every direction, phones recording, journalists scribbling, his carefully constructed empire of reputation beginning to crack beneath his feet. Of course you are, he said, forcing warmth into his voice. You've always been. Favour smiled then. It wasn't cruel. It was worse than that. It was pitying. Then why, she said, her voice still soft, still calm, did you introduce me to your publicist 3 months ago as a family friend? Richard froze. She continued, her tone never rising, never sharpening, just steady, factual, devastating. Why did you tell your lawyer last year that acknowledging me publicly would complicate your brand? Why did Carolyn refer to me as that situation when she thought I couldn't hear? Each question landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward. People were listening now, not pretending to look away. Fully, openly listening. Richard's face burned. Favour, you don't understand the pressures I was under. I understand perfectly, she interrupted, and for the first time there was an edge in her voice, small but sharp. You were ashamed of me. That's not true. You were ashamed of my mother. Favour, you were ashamed that I existed. Her voice cracked, just once, on the last word. And in that crack, Richard saw the little girl who used to wait by the staircase with crayon drawings, the teenager who sat at the far end of the dinner table in silence, the young woman who left his house in the middle of the night with nothing but a duffel bag and a broken heart. He had done that. He had broken her. And now she was standing in front of him, unbroken, stronger than he ever was, and he didn't know how to fix it. "I'm sorry," he whispered. It was the first time he'd ever said it to her. Favour looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were dry, but there was something unbearably sad in them. "I don't think you are," she said quietly. "I think you're sorry people found out." The words hit him like a fist to the chest. Before he could respond, a voice cut through the crowd. "Excuse me, Mr. Hawthorne?" Richard turned to see a young woman in a sleek black suit holding a microphone. A camera operator stood behind her, red recording light glowing. "A journalist." His stomach dropped. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the journalist said, her smile sharp and professional, "but I'm with Metropolitan today, and I'd love to get a comment. Is it true that this woman," she gestured toward Favour, "is your daughter? And if so, why has she never been publicly acknowledged?" Richard's mouth went dry. The camera was rolling, the crowd had gone silent, every eye in the room was on him. He looked at Favour. She said nothing, did nothing, just stood there, waiting. And Richard realized, with a sinking, suffocating certainty, that whatever he said next would define the rest of his life. "She," he swallowed. "Yes, she's my daughter." The journalist's eyebrows lifted. "And why the secrecy?" Richard opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Favour again, her calm, unreadable face, her hands folded in front of her, her entire posture radiating a quiet, unshakable strength. He could lie, spin it, blame the media, blame timing, blame circumstances, but she would know, and so would everyone else. "I made a mistake," he said finally, his voice rough. "I was a coward, and I failed her." The journalist blinked, clearly not expecting honesty. The room was deathly silent. Richard looked at Favour, his eyes wet now, his voice breaking. "I failed you, Favour. I'm sorry." For a moment, she said nothing. Then, quietly, almost gently, she spoke. "I know." And she turned and walked away. The crowd parted for her like water. Richard stood alone in the center of the ballroom, the camera still recording, the silence pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't lift. And across the room, Carolyn's face had gone white. Oliver and Grace stood frozen near the bar, staring at their father with expressions he couldn't read. The gala was no longer his. It belonged to her now. Favour made it halfway to the exit before the room erupted. Voices overlapped, some calling her name, others shouting questions at Richard. The journalist's microphone swung wildly as she tried to follow Favour through the crowd. Camera flashes sparked like lightning. The carefully orchestrated elegance of the gala had collapsed into chaos. She kept walking, her heels clicking steadily against the marble, her shoulders square, her breathing controlled. She had spent 7 years perfecting the art of walking away from rooms that wanted to consume her. This was no different, except it was. Because this time, she wasn't running. She was choosing. "Favour, wait." The voice came from behind her, not Richard's, but younger. Desperate. She stopped, turned. Oliver stood 10 feet away, his face flushed, his tie slightly loosened. He looked nothing like the polished golden boy who had ignored her for 20 years. He looked terrified. "Please," he said, breathless. "Just wait, please." Favour studied him. She hadn't spoken to Oliver in 7 years. The last time she saw him, he was 18, heading off to Yale, barely acknowledging her existence as he loaded suitcases into a car that cost more than her mother's annual salary. Now he was 25. A vice president at Hawthorne Capital, engaged to a socialite whose family owned half of the city's real estate. And he was looking at her like she was the only person in the room. "What do you want, Oliver?" she asked quietly. He flinched at the flatness in her voice. He ran a hand through his hair, glancing back toward the ballroom where their father still stood, frozen under the journalist's relentless questioning. "I didn't know about any of this. About you." Favour tilted her head. "You didn't know I existed, or you didn't know I mattered?" The words were surgical. Oliver's face crumpled. That's not fair, isn't it? He opened his mouth, closed it. His hands fell to his sides, helpless. I was a kid, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't understand what was happening. I saw how Mum and Dad treated you, and I thought that's how it was supposed to be. And now I know I was wrong. Favour stared at him. She wanted to feel anger, bitterness, the sharp satisfaction of watching him squirm, but all she felt was tired. It's too late, Oliver. No. He stepped forward, his voice breaking. No, it's not. I know I can't fix the past. I know I was part of the problem. But Favour, you're my sister. And I'm standing here, in front of everyone, asking you not to leave. Not like this. Why? She asked. So your father doesn't look worse than he already does? So the cameras get a nice reconciliation shot? No. His eyes were wet now. Because I don't want to lose you again. The honesty in his voice stopped her. She looked past him, toward the ballroom. Through the open doors, she could see Richard being swarmed by journalists. Carolyn standing off to the side, her arms crossed, her face a mask of cold fury. Grace, her half-sister, hovering near a pillar, her expression unreadable. And beyond them, the guests, the investors, the power brokers, all watching. Favour exhaled slowly. 5 minutes, she said. Oliver's face flooded with relief. Thank you. Not here. She turned and walked toward a side hallway that led away from the ballroom, away from the cameras and the noise. Oliver followed. They found an empty sitting room, one of the hotel's private lounges, decorated in soft blues and golds, with tall windows overlooking the city. The door clicked shut behind them, muffling the chaos outside. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Oliver stood near the door, his hands shoved into his pockets, his shoulders tense. Favour moved to the window, her arms crossed, her reflection ghostly in the glass. I used to watch you, Oliver said suddenly. Favour glanced back at him. When we were kids, he continued, his voice soft, I'd see you in the hallways, at dinner, and I wanted to talk to you. I wanted to ask you things, what you liked, what you were reading, if you wanted to play. He paused, swallowing hard. But Mum would look at me, and I knew that if I got close to you, I'd be choosing you over her. And I was too much of a coward to do that. Favour turned fully to face him now, her expression unreadable. You were a child, Oliver. I don't blame you for that. Then, what do you blame me for? The question was raw, honest. Favour's jaw tightened. For becoming him, she said quietly. For growing up and choosing to stay silent. For seeing me at family events and pretending I didn't exist. For letting Carolyn call me that girl and never once telling her to stop. Oliver's face crumpled. You're right. I know I am. I was a coward. I know. He stepped forward, his voice shaking. But I'm here now. I'm standing here, and I'm telling you that I see you. I see what you've built. I see what Dad refused to see. Favour's throat tightened. And I'm asking, begging for a chance to be your brother. Not because of what happened tonight, not because of the cameras, but because I've spent 7 years regretting that I never fought for you. His voice broke completely, and I don't want to regret it for the rest of my life. Favour stared at him, her chest tight, her hands trembling. She wanted to say no, to walk away, to protect herself the way she always had. But she saw something in Oliver's face that she hadn't seen in years. Sincerity. I don't trust you, she said finally. Oliver nodded, tears streaming down his face. I know, and I don't forgive you. I understand, but, she exhaled shakily, I'll give you a chance to prove you mean what you're saying. Oliver's breath hitched. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Favour said quietly. You haven't earned it. I will. His voice was fierce now. I swear, Favour, I will. Before she could respond, the door opened. Grace stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked between them, her eyes wide and uncertain. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice small. Favour's walls shot back up instantly. "I don't think—" "Please," Grace's voice cracked. "I just need to say something." Favour looked at Oliver, who nodded gently. She sighed. "Fine." Grace stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. She stood near the entrance, as if afraid to come closer. "I'm sorry," she said, the words tumbling out. "I'm sorry for every time I ignored you, for every time I let Mum say horrible things and didn't stop her, for every time I acted like you didn't exist." Her voice shook. "I was raised to think you were a mistake, a scandal, something to be managed and hidden." She looked up, tears streaming down her face. "But you're not. You're brilliant, you're powerful, and you're my sister." Favour's chest ached. "And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Grace continued, "but I need you to know that I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed of how I treated you, and I'm standing here because I can't walk out of this room without telling you that." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Favour looked at Grace, really looked at her, and saw something she hadn't expected. Genuine remorse. "I don't know what to say," Favour admitted quietly. "You don't have to say anything," Grace whispered. "I just needed you to hear it." Favour nodded slowly, and for the first time in her life, she stood in a room with her siblings, not as the forgotten daughter, not as the secret, not as the mistake, but as an equal. It didn't heal the wounds, but it was a start. Outside, the gala continued to unravel. But in that quiet room, something fragile and new began to grow. Grace sank into one of the velvet chairs near the window, her hands still trembling. Oliver remained standing, his eyes red-rimmed but steady. Favour stayed by the window, her arms wrapped around herself like armour she couldn't quite remove. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Grace's voice, soft and hesitant, broke the silence. "Do you remember the summer I turned 12? Favour blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "The summer I turned 12, Grace repeated, looking down at her hands. "There was a birthday party. Mum hired the event planner, rented out the country club, invited everyone." Favour's jaw tightened. She remembered. She had watched from her bedroom window as cars pulled up, as children in expensive clothes poured onto the lawn, as balloons and banners transformed the estate into something out of a fairy tale. She had not been invited. "I saw you," Grace whispered. "I saw you watching from your window." Favour's breath caught. "I wanted to invite you," Grace continued, her voice breaking. "I asked Mum if you could come, just for an hour. Just to have cake." She looked up, tears spilling over, and she said no. She said you would make the other parents uncomfortable, that it would raise questions she didn't want to answer. Favour's throat burned. "I didn't fight her," Grace said, her voice barely audible. "I should have, but I didn't. I went to my party. I smiled for pictures. I ate cake. And I pretended I didn't see you standing at that window." She wiped her eyes roughly. "I've thought about that day every year since, and I hate myself for it." Favour turned away, staring out at the city lights blurring through her own unshed tears. She had buried that memory so deeply she'd almost convinced herself it didn't matter. But it did. It always had. "You were a child," Favour said quietly, her voice tight. "You didn't have power over Carolyn. But I had a voice," Grace insisted, "and I stayed silent." Oliver spoke then, his voice rough. "We both did." Favour turned back to them, her face hard. "So why now? Why, after all these years, do you suddenly care?" Oliver met her gaze. "Because tonight I watched you walk into that ballroom and own it. I watched a man drop to his knees in front of you. I watched the most powerful people in the city realize they'd underestimated you. His voice cracked. And I realized I'd been doing the same thing my whole life. That's not an answer, Favour said sharply. That's guilt. Guilt isn't the same as caring. You're right, Oliver said. But it's a start. Favour shook her head, exhausted. I don't know if I have the energy for this. Then let us carry some of it, Grace said softly. Favour looked at her, startled. Grace stood, crossing the room slowly. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to reach out but respecting the distance Favour needed. You've been carrying everything alone, Grace said. The hurt, the rejection, the weight of building a whole life without family, and you did it. You became someone extraordinary. Her voice trembled. But you shouldn't have had to do it alone. Favour's defences wavered, just slightly. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice breaking. Nothing, Grace said. We want to give you something. A family, a real one. It's too late for that. Maybe, Oliver said, stepping closer. But maybe it's not too late to start. Favour looked between them, these two people who had been strangers wearing her blood. She wanted to believe them. God. She wanted to. But belief was dangerous. I need air, she said abruptly, turning toward the door. Favour, Oliver started. I'm not leaving, she said, her hand on the doorknob. I need a minute. She slipped out before they could respond. The hallway was blessedly empty. She leaned against the wall, pressing her palms to her eyes, willing herself not to break. Not here. Not now. You always did know how to make an exit. Favour's head snapped up. Her mother stood at the end of the hall. Diane Thompson was 52 years old, her hair streaked with silver. She refused to dye, her frame still strong despite years of working 2 jobs to keep them afloat after leaving Richard. She wore a simple navy dress, elegant, understated, nothing like the glittering gowns inside the ballroom. She looked like home. Mum, Favour breathed. What are you doing here? You think I'd miss my daughter's coronation? Diane's smile was small and fierce. Favour's composure shattered. She crossed the hallway in 3 steps and fell into her mother's arms, and for the first time all night, she let herself cry. Diane held her tightly, one hand stroking her hair, whispering the same words she'd whispered 1,000 times before. I'm so proud of you, baby. So proud. Favour sobbed into her mother's shoulder, all the years of silence and hurt and triumph pouring out in broken, gasping breaths. I didn't think it would feel like this. She choked out. Like what? Like winning and losing at the same time. Diane pulled back just enough to cup Favour's face in her hands, her eyes fierce and wet. You haven't lost anything, baby. You just found out what you never needed. What's that? His approval. Favour let out a shaky laugh. I don't know what I'm doing, Mama. Yes, you do, Diane said firmly. You've always known. You're just scared to believe you deserve it. Deserve what? Everything. Favour's breath hitched. Diane smiled, brushing tears from her daughter's cheeks. You've spent your whole life proving you're enough, and tonight the world finally caught up. But Oliver and Grace are trying, Diane interrupted gently. And that's more than Richard ever did. Favour hesitated. You think I should give them a chance? I think you should do whatever your heart can handle, Diane said. But don't close the door just because you're afraid of getting hurt again. You're stronger than that. Favour closed her eyes, leaning into her mother's touch. I don't know if I can forgive him, she whispered. You don't have to, Diane said. Forgiveness isn't a requirement. But healing is. And sometimes healing means letting people see the damage they caused. Favour nodded slowly. Diane kissed her forehead. Now, do you want to go back in there and finish what you started? Or do you want to go home? Favour thought about it. The gala, the cameras, Richard's crumbling reputation, Oliver and Grace's tentative apologies. And then she thought about the woman she'd become, the woman who didn't need anyone's permission to own her power. I'm going back in, she said quietly. Diane's smile was radiant. That's my girl." They walked back toward the ballroom together, side by side. And when the doors opened, the crowd turned. But this time, Favour wasn't walking in alone. When Favour and Diane stepped back into the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The chaos had settled into something quieter, more watchful. Conversations hummed in low tones. Phones were still out, but the frantic energy had cooled into something more observant, more curious. And every pair of eyes tracked Favour as she moved through the room. But this time, she wasn't alone. Diane walked beside her, her head high, her hand resting gently on her daughter's arm. The contrast was striking. Diane, in her simple navy dress, Favour in her black gown, both of them radiating a quiet, unshakable dignity that no amount of wealth in that room could buy. Richard saw them first. He stood near the bar, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand, his face drawn and pale. When his eyes landed on Diane, something flickered across his expression: regret, longing, shame, maybe all three. Diane met his gaze evenly. She didn't smile, didn't frown, just looked at him the way one might look at a chapter of a book they'd finished long ago. Then she turned her attention back to her daughter, and Richard understood. He had lost his place in her story years ago. Oliver appeared at Favour's side, slightly breathless. "You came back." "I said I would," Favour replied. Grace joined them a moment later, her eyes still red, but her expression softer. She looked at Diane and hesitated, then extended her hand. "Mrs. Thompson," she said quietly. "I'm Grace." Diane studied her for a moment, then took her hand. "I know who you are." Grace flinched slightly, but Diane's grip was firm, not cruel. "You look like your father," Diane said, "but I hope you'll choose to be better than him." Grace's breath hitched. "I'm trying." Diane nodded. "Then keep trying." She released Grace's hand and turned to Oliver, who stood frozen, his hands shoved into his pockets. "And you," Diane said, "you're the one who used to build Lego towers in the living room." Oliver blinked, startled. "You remember that?" "I remember everything," Diane said simply. "I was there longer than you think." Oliver's face crumpled slightly. "I'm sorry for all of it." "Tell her." "Not me," Diane said, nodding toward Favour. Oliver turned to his sister, his throat working. "I am sorry, Favour. Every day. For everything." Favour looked at him, her walls still high but not impenetrable. "I know," she said softly. Before anyone could say more, a familiar voice interrupted. "Excuse me." They turned to see Jonathan Pierce approaching, flanked by two other executives. Favour recognized a woman who ran a global non-profit and a man who had revolutionized clean energy infrastructure in East Africa. Both of them were smiling. "I hope we're not intruding," Jonathan said, "but we wanted to invite you to join us at our table." He gestured toward a corner of the ballroom where several high-profile guests had gathered, their chairs angled toward an empty seat, clearly meant for her. "We've been talking," the non-profit director said, her voice warm, "and we'd be honored if you'd sit with us. We have some ideas we'd love to run by you." Favour glanced at her mother. Diane smiled. "Go ahead, baby. I'll be right here." Favour hesitated, then nodded. "All right." As she moved toward the table, Oliver and Grace exchanged a glance. "Can we come?" Grace asked, her voice small. Favour paused, turned. For a moment, she just looked at them, these siblings who had spent most of their lives pretending she didn't exist. Then slowly, she nodded. Yes. Relief washed over both their faces. Together, the three of them walked across the ballroom. And for the first time in 25 years, they walked as family. The table was a cluster of brilliance. CEOs, activists, inventors, people who had changed industries and saved lives. They welcomed Favour like she'd always belonged there. Because she had. Jonathan pulled out a chair for her. "We were just discussing the East African Water Initiative. There's been some pushback from local governments, and we're stuck. The clean energy executive leaned forward. We thought maybe you'd have insight. Off the record, of course. Favour settled into her seat, her mind already shifting into strategy mode. What kind of pushback? She asked. For the next 20 minutes, they talked. Not about Richard, not about the scandal, not about her past. They talked about systems, solutions, the intricate, beautiful puzzles that Favour had spent years solving in silence. And she felt herself breathe. This was where she belonged. Not in the shadows of someone else's legacy, but at the table where ideas became change. Oliver and Grace sat quietly at first, listening. But gradually, Grace began to ask questions, thoughtful ones. Oliver contributed an observation about policy structures that actually made Favour pause and reconsider an angle. She glanced at him, surprised. He gave a small, sheepish shrug. I've been paying attention. Something softened in her chest. Across the ballroom, Richard stood alone near the windows, watching. He saw his children, all three of them, sitting together, talking, laughing softly at something Jonathan said. He saw the way the most powerful people in the room leaned toward Favour when she spoke, the way they valued her words like gold. He saw everything he had refused to see for 25 years, and it broke him. Carolyn appeared beside him, her face tight. This is a disaster. Richard didn't respond. Half our donors are reconsidering their commitments, she continued. The press is already running stories. Your reputation is gone, Richard finished quietly. I know. Carolyn stared at him. And you're just going to accept that? Richard looked at her, and for the first time in their 30-year marriage, he saw her clearly. I destroyed the best thing I ever helped create, he said, and I did it because I was ashamed, because I cared more about what people like you thought than I cared about my own daughter. Carolyn's eyes flashed. People like me? Yes, Richard said. People who measure worth by pedigree and optics. People who see a child as a scandal instead of a miracle. Carolyn's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Richard turned back to the window. I don't know how to fix this, but I know I can't keep pretending it's not my fault. He set his glass down and walked away, leaving Carolyn standing alone in her glittering gown, surrounded by wealth, but utterly isolated. Richard crossed the ballroom slowly. Favour saw him coming. The table quieted. He stopped a few feet away, his hands clasped in front of him, his shoulders slumped. I don't want to interrupt, he said quietly. I wanted to say something. Favour's expression was unreadable. Then say it. Richard swallowed hard. You deserved better. You deserved a father who was proud of you, who claimed you, who loved you openly. His voice broke, and I failed. Completely. The table was silent. I know I can't undo it, Richard continued. I know an apology doesn't fix 25 years of neglect, but I need you to know. He looked at her, his eyes wet. I see you now, and I'm in awe of you. Favour's jaw tightened. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, quietly, she spoke. Thank you for saying that. Richard exhaled, a broken sound. But it doesn't change anything, Favour added. Not yet. Richard nodded, tears slipping down his face. I understand. He turned to leave. Richard, he stopped. Favour stood, her voice steady. If you mean what you said, prove it. Not with words, with action. Richard looked back at her, desperate hope flickering in his eyes. How? Start by being the man you should have been, Favour said. Not for me, for yourself. Richard's breath hitched. I will. I swear, I will. Favour nodded once, then sat back down. Richard walked away, and for the first time in his life, he felt the full weight of what he'd lost. But also, faintly, the possibility of what he might still become. Back at the table, Jonathan raised his glass. To Favour. The woman who built an empire in silence and changed the world without asking for credit. The others raised their glasses. To Favour, they echoed. She smiled small, genuine, and free. For the first time all night, she felt like she could breathe. The evening had found a rhythm. Favour sat at the table, surrounded by people who valued her mind, her vision, her voice. Oliver and Grace had begun to relax, contributing to the conversation, laughing tentatively when someone made a joke. Across the room, Diane sat with a small group of older women, other mothers, other survivors, sharing quiet stories over tea. For a fleeting moment, Favour allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, something good could come from this night. Then Carolyn's voice shattered the illusion. "Well, isn't this cozy?" The table went quiet. Carolyn stood at the edge of their circle, a fresh glass of champagne in her hand, her smile sharp as broken glass. Her eyes were cold, assessing, and fixed directly on Favour. "Mother," Grace said quietly, a warning in her tone. Carolyn ignored her. "I have to hand it to you, Favour. You certainly know how to make an entrance." Very theatrical. Favour set down her glass slowly, her expression neutral. "Carolyn." "Oh, don't worry," Carolyn said, her voice light but venomous. "I'm not here to cause a scene. I just wanted to congratulate you." "On what?" Favour asked evenly. "On finally getting what you've always wanted." Carolyn took a sip of champagne, her eyes never leaving Favour's face. "Attention, recognition, a seat at the table." Jonathan stiffened. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I don't think—" "I'm speaking to my husband's daughter," Carolyn interrupted smoothly. "Surely she can handle a simple conversation." Favour's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. Carolyn leaned in slightly, her voice dropping just enough that only those at the table could hear. "You must be so proud of yourself. Walking in here, playing the victim, letting these people fawn over you. It's quite the performance." "Mother, stop," Oliver said, his voice hard. "Why should I?" Carolyn snapped, turning on him. "She's done nothing but embarrass this family for 25 years. And tonight she parades in here like some kind of savior." "She is a savior," Grace said, standing abruptly. "She's accomplished more than any of us ever will." Carolyn's eyes flashed. "Sit down, Grace." "No." The word rang out, clear and defiant. Carolyn's face went pale, then red. "Excuse me?" "I said no," Grace repeated, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm not going to sit here and let you talk to her like that. Not anymore. You have no idea what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "I know that you taught me to be ashamed of her, that you made me believe she was something to hide, and I'm done." Carolyn's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Oliver stood as well. "Grace is right. This ends now." Carolyn looked between her children, her expression a mixture of shock and fury. "You're choosing her over me?" "We're choosing what's right," Oliver said quietly. Carolyn's face twisted. She turned back to Favour, and something ugly and desperate flickered in her eyes. "You think you've won," she hissed. "You think because these people are impressed by your little empire that makes you one of us. But you're not." She leaned in closer, her voice a venomous whisper. "You'll always be the mistake, the proof of Richard's infidelity. The stain on this family's name." The words landed like physical blows. Favour felt the air leave her lungs, felt the eyes of everyone at the table on her, felt the old, familiar shame rising up like a tide she thought she'd outrun. "And no matter how successful you become," Carolyn continued, her smile cruel, "you'll never erase the fact that you were unwanted, that your own father couldn't stand to look at you." Favour's hands trembled. Across the room Diane stood, her face dark with fury, already moving toward them. But before she could reach the table, Favour spoke. Her voice was quiet, too quiet. "You're right." Everyone froze. Favour looked up at Carolyn, her eyes dry but devastated. "You're right. I was unwanted. I was a mistake. I was something to be hidden and managed and erased." Her voice cracked. And no matter what I accomplish, no matter how many companies I save or lives I change, I'll never be able to erase the fact that the people who were supposed to love me couldn't even look at me. Tears slipped down her cheeks, silent and relentless. So congratulations, Carolyn. You win. You've reminded me of exactly what I've spent my entire life trying to forget. She stood, her chair scraping against the floor. Favour. Oliver reached for her. Don't, she said, her voice breaking. Please, just don't. She turned and walked away, her shoulders shaking, her composure finally completely shattered. Diane intercepted her before she reached the doors, pulling her into a fierce embrace. Favour collapsed against her mother, sobbing openly now, all the years of pain pouring out in front of everyone. I want to leave, she choked out. Please, Mama, I can't do this anymore. Okay, baby, Diane whispered, stroking her hair. Okay, we'll go. Behind them, the ballroom had gone deathly silent. Carolyn stood frozen, her champagne glass trembling in her hand, her face pale. Grace was crying openly, her hands over her mouth. Oliver looked like he'd been struck. And Richard, who had been watching from across the room, began walking toward Carolyn, his face a mask of fury. What have you done? He said, his voice low and dangerous. Carolyn turned to him, defiant. I told her the truth. You destroyed her, Richard said, his voice shaking. You destroyed the strongest person in this room because you couldn't stand that she was better than all of us. She's not. She is, Richard roared, and the room flinched. His voice broke. She's brilliant. She's kind. She's everything I should have celebrated. And you. He stepped closer, his eyes burning. You made sure she'd never feel like she belonged, because you were threatened by a child. Carolyn's face crumpled. Richard, don't, he said coldly. We're done. He turned and walked toward Favour and Diane, leaving Carolyn standing alone in the center of the ballroom, trembling and exposed. Richard stopped a few feet away from Favour, his hands raised in surrender. Favour, he said, his voice raw, please, don't go, not like this. Favour turned, her face wet, her eyes red. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why should I stay? Because you deserve better than to leave believing what she said. She's right, though, Favour said, her voice breaking. I was unwanted. No. Richard stepped closer, tears streaming down his face. You were loved. By your mother. By people in this room. And by me, even if I was too much of a coward to show it. Favour shook her head. It's too late. Maybe, Richard said, but I'm begging you, don't let her take this night from you. Don't let her make you believe you're anything less than extraordinary. Favour looked at him. This man who had failed her in every possible way and saw something she'd never seen before. Genuine remorse. But it wasn't enough. I need to go, she whispered. She turned toward the doors, and this time, no one stopped her. Diane led her daughter out of the ballroom, away from the lights and the cameras and the people who had finally seen her only to watch her break. Behind them, the gala continued. But the night belonged to ghosts now. The hotel room was silent, except for the sound of Favour's breathing. She sat on the edge of the bed, still in her black gown, her shoes discarded on the floor, her hands folded in her lap. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the city lights, leaving only the dim glow of a single lamp. Diane sat beside her, saying nothing. Just present, just there. They had been sitting like this for 20 minutes. Finally, Favour spoke, her voice hoarse. I shouldn't have gone. Maybe, Diane said quietly. Or maybe you needed to. For what? To be humiliated? To have her throw everything I've tried to bury back in my face? Diane turned to look at her daughter. To see who's really in your corner. Favour laughed bitterly. No one is. That's not true. Isn't it? Favour's voice rose, cracking. Oliver and Grace were silent for 25 years. Richard only apologized because he got caught. And Carolyn, her voice broke completely. She said, exactly what I've always believed about myself. Diane's eyes filled with tears. "Baby, I'm a mistake, Mama," Favour whispered. "I've always been a mistake." "No." Diane's voice was fierce. She took Favour's face in her hands, forcing her daughter to meet her eyes. "You listen to me. You are not a mistake. You are not unwanted. You are the best thing I have ever done with my life." Favour's face crumpled. "Richard's failure to see you doesn't define your worth," Diane continued, her voice shaking. "Carolyn's cruelty doesn't erase your brilliance. And the fact that it took the world 25 years to catch up doesn't mean you weren't always extraordinary. Then why does it hurt so much?" Favour sobbed. "Because you're human," Diane whispered, "and because you loved people who didn't love you back the way you deserved." She pulled Favour into her arms, holding her while she wept. "But you are loved, baby. By me. By people whose lives you've changed. By people who see you for exactly who you are." Favour clung to her mother, her body shaking with the weight of everything she'd been carrying alone. After a long while, her sobs quieted. She pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I don't know what to do now." "What do you want to do?" Favour was quiet for a moment. "I want to disappear," she admitted. "I want to go back to being invisible, to never having to see their faces again." Diane nodded slowly. "You could do that." Favour looked at her, surprised. "You could walk away," Diane said. "Go back to your life. Keep building your empire in silence. Never speak to any of them again." She paused. "But is that what you really want, or is it just what feels safe?" Favour's throat tightened. "I don't know." Diane took her hand. "Then let me ask you this. If you walk away now, will you regret it?" Favour closed her eyes. She thought about Oliver's tears, Grace's apology, Richard's broken voice. She thought about the table full of people who had valued her mind, her ideas, her presence. She thought about the look on Carolyn's face when her own children chose Favour over her. And she thought about the little girl who used to stand by the window, hoping someone would invite her to the party. "I don't want to regret anything anymore," Favour whispered. "Then don't," Diane said gently. "Whatever you choose, walking away or going back, make sure it's your choice, not theirs, not fear's, yours." Favour opened her eyes. For a long moment, she just sat there, breathing. Then, slowly, she stood. "I need to talk to them." Diane smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "Then let's go." The ballroom was quieter now. Most of the guests had left, scandalized or uncomfortable or simply bored now that the drama had subsided. Only a few dozen people remained close friends of the family, a handful of journalists lurking near the exits, and the core group who had gathered around Favour's table. Richard sat alone near the windows, his head in his hands. Oliver and Grace stood together near the bar, their faces drawn, speaking in low, urgent tones. Carolyn was nowhere to be seen. When the doors opened and Favour walked in, every head turned. She had changed no longer in her gown, but in simple jeans and a white blouse, her hair pulled back, her face bare. She looked younger, softer, but no less powerful. Diane walked beside her, steady as always. Richard saw her first. He stood slowly, his face a mixture of hope and terror. Oliver and Grace turned, their expressions crumbling with relief. Favour stopped in the centre of the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then Oliver crossed the space between them, stopping a few feet away. "You came back," he said, his voice thick. "I did," Favour said quietly. "Why?" She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the golden boy who had ignored her, but a man who was trying, desperately, to be better. "Because I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd given you a real chance." Oliver's breath hitched. "Thank you." Grace approached next, her eyes red and swollen. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "For what Mom said. For everything." Favour's jaw tightened. "Where is she?" "She left," Grace said. "Right after you did. She packed a bag and left." Favour felt a strange, hollow ache in her chest. Not sadness, not relief, just emptiness. "Good," she said finally. Grace nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. Favour turned to Richard. He stood frozen, his hands trembling at his sides, his eyes pleading. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Favour said, her voice steady but soft. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to call you Dad or feel like you're really my father." Richard's face crumpled, but he nodded. "I understand, but," Favour continued, "I'm willing to let you try, to prove that you mean what you said, not for my sake but for yours." Richard let out a broken sob. "I will. I swear, Favour, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the father you deserved." Favour looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay." The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of a second chance. Richard crossed the room, stopping just in front of her. He lifted his hand, hesitant, and Favour, after a long, painful pause, took it. His grip was firm, desperate, grateful. "Thank you," he whispered. Favour didn't respond. She just held his hand for a moment, then let go. She turned to the rest of the room. Jonathan and the others at the table stood, watching quietly. "I'm sorry I left like that," Favour said. Jonathan shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for. But I do want to say something," Favour continued. She took a breath, her voice growing stronger. "I spent my whole life hiding, building empires in secret, changing the world without ever letting anyone see my face. I told myself it was because I valued my privacy. But the truth is, I was afraid." Her voice shook. "I was afraid that if people knew who I was, if they saw where I came from, they wouldn't respect my work, they wouldn't value my mind." She looked around the room. "But tonight, I realized something. The people who matter don't care where I came from, they care about what I've built, who I've become." Her eyes landed on Oliver and Grace. "And the people who've hurt me? They don't get to define me anymore." She turned to Richard. "Not even you." Richard nodded, tears streaming down his face. Favour exhaled slowly. "So from now on, I'm done hiding. I'm done being invisible. I'm going to live my life in the open, not because I need anyone's approval, but because I deserve to be seen." The room was silent. Then, slowly, Jonathan began to clap. The others joined him. The applause built, warm and genuine, filling the ballroom. Favour stood in the centre of it, tears slipping down her cheeks, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a mistake. She felt like herself. 6 months later, the morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Favour's office, painting everything in gold. The space was sleek but warm bookshelves, lined with strategy texts and novels, a wide desk scattered with sketches and plans, and a wall covered in photographs. Some were of her mother, some were of the teams she'd worked with over the years. And now, recently added, a few showed her standing beside Oliver and Grace at a quiet family dinner. No cameras, no performance, just them. Favour stood at the window, a cup of coffee in her hand, looking out over the city she had conquered in silence and now walked through freely. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and smiled. "Oliver, Grace and I are outside, ready when you are." She typed back quickly. "Favour, 2 minutes." She set down her coffee, grabbed her jacket, and took one last look around the office. On her desk sat a framed newspaper clipping from the night of the gala. The headline read, "The Strategist Revealed: How a Billionaire's Hidden Daughter Built an Empire in the Shadows." Beneath it, in smaller print, "Favour Thompson steps into the light, and the world is better for it." She touched the frame lightly, then turned and walked out. Downstairs, Oliver and Grace waited beside a sleek black car. Oliver was scrolling through his phone. Grace was adjusting her sunglasses, smiling at something on her screen. When Favour stepped outside, they both looked up. "Ready?" Grace asked. "As I'll ever be," Favour said. They climbed into the car together. The driver pulled into traffic smoothly, heading toward the edge of the city. "Nervous?" Oliver asked. "A little," Favour admitted. "He's been working really hard," Grace said gently. "He wants this to go well." Favour nodded but said nothing. The truth was, she didn't know what to expect. Over the past 6 months, Richard had done exactly what he'd promised. He'd stepped down from half his board positions and redirected his energy toward non-profit work, specifically funding scholarships for children from marginalized communities. He'd publicly acknowledged Favour, not as a PR stunt, but in a raw, honest interview where he admitted his failures as a father. He'd called her every week, not to ask for forgiveness, just to check in, to listen. Slowly, painfully, they had begun to build something fragile and new. But today was different. Today was the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Diane Thompson Youth Innovation Center, a fully funded space for young people to learn coding, business strategy, design thinking, and entrepreneurship. Richard had built it, but he'd named it after Favour's mother. It was his way of saying what words couldn't. The center was beautiful. Nestled in a neighborhood that had been overlooked for decades, the building gleamed with fresh paint and wide windows. Inside, rows of new computers, maker spaces, art studios, and quiet reading rooms waited for the young people who would fill them. A small crowd had gathered outside, community members, local officials, a few journalists, and at the center of it all stood Richard, looking older and quieter than he had 6 months ago. When he saw Favour step out of the car, his face lit up, not with pride in himself, but with gratitude that she'd come. Diane was already there, standing near the entrance, greeting people warmly. When she saw her daughter, she smiled steady, proud, unshakable. Favour crossed the space and embraced her. "You okay?" Diane whispered. "I think so," Favour said. "Then let's do this." Together, they walked toward Richard. He stood when he saw them, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. "Favour," he said quietly. "Diane, thank you for coming." Diane nodded but said nothing. Her presence was acknowledgement enough. Favour met his eyes. "This is beautiful, Richard." He smiled, small and tentative. "It's the least I could do." "It's more than that," Favour said. "It's a start." Richard's breath hitched. "Thank you." A local official stepped up to the microphone, welcoming everyone and explaining the center's mission. Then, Richard was called to speak. He approached the microphone slowly, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "This center represents something I should have valued my whole life: community, opportunity, and the belief that every young person deserves a chance to build something extraordinary." He paused, his voice catching. "For too long, I measured success by wealth and status. I ignored the people who mattered most. I failed the people I should have protected." His eyes found Favour in the crowd. "But my daughter Favour Thompson taught me something I should have known all along. True legacy isn't built in boardrooms or on balance sheets. It's built in the lives we change, the people we lift up, the love we give freely." His voice broke. "I named this center after Diane Thompson because she is the strongest, most selfless person I have ever known. She raised a daughter who became everything I could never be. And I am honored, humbled, to play even a small part in continuing that legacy." He stepped back from the microphone, tears streaming down his face. The crowd applauded. Favour felt her own eyes burning. Diane reached over and squeezed her hand. Then the official invited Favour to cut the ribbon. She hesitated, then stepped forward. The ribbon stretched across the entrance, bright red against the white walls. Cameras flashed. People cheered. But Favour wasn't thinking about them. She was thinking about the girl she used to be, the one who stood at windows, invisible and aching. And she was thinking about the woman she'd become. She lifted the scissors and cut the ribbon. The doors opened. Inside, children were already waiting, wide-eyed, hopeful, ready to learn. Favour stepped inside, and they surrounded her, asking questions, showing her their projects, pulling her toward the computer lab. She laughed a real, full, joyful sound and let them lead her. Behind her, Richard stood with Diane, Oliver, and Grace, watching. "She's incredible," Grace whispered. "She always has been," Diane said quietly. Richard nodded, his voice thick. "I just wish I'd seen it sooner." "Then make sure you see it now," Diane said, her tone firm but not unkind. "Every day, for the rest of your life." "I will," Richard promised. And for the first time, Diane believed him. That evening, after the ceremony, the five of them, Favour, Diane, Richard, Oliver, and Grace, sat together at a small restaurant tucked away from the noise of the city. It wasn't fancy. No photographers. No speeches. Just family. They talked about the center, about the kids' excitement, about future plans, and slowly, carefully, they began to talk about the past. Not to relive it, but to acknowledge it, to let it exist without letting it control them. At one point, Richard reached across the table and placed an envelope in front of Favour. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it," he said quietly. She did. Inside was a handwritten letter, his handwriting messy, unsteady. It began, "Dear Favour, I know I can't undo the past. I know I can't give you the childhood you deserved, but I want you to know that every day I am working to become the father you deserve now. I am proud of you, not because of what you've accomplished, though that is extraordinary, but because of who you are. You are kind, you are brilliant, you are resilient. You are my daughter, and I love you. I always have. I was just too broken to show it. I'm learning now, and I hope one day you'll be able to believe me. With all my love, Richard." Favour's hands trembled as she read. When she looked up, Richard was watching her, his eyes wet. "I meant every word," he whispered. Favour folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Then, for the first time in her life, she reached across the table and took his hand. "I believe you," she said softly. Richard's face crumpled. He held her hand like it was the most precious thing in the world. Across the table, Diane smiled. Oliver and Grace exchanged a look hopeful, relieved. And Favour felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Later that night, Favour stood on the balcony of her apartment, looking out over the city. Her phone buzzed. A message from Jonathan Pierce. "Jonathan, saw the news about the center. You're changing the world, boss. Proud to know you." She smiled and typed back, "Favour, just getting started." She set the phone down and closed her eyes, breathing in the cool night air. For so long, she had fought to be seen. And now, finally, she was. Not because of her father's name, not because of wealth or status, but because of the life she had built with her own hands. She was Favour Thompson, the strategist, the boss, the daughter who refused to be forgotten. And her story, her real story, was only just beginning. Have you ever had to fight to be seen by the people who should have loved you most? Drop your thoughts below because your story matters and we want to hear it.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you love this story, you will surely enjoy the next one. It's crazier and more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.